Hi guys, so today I have another gem of Coleman Hughes for you. It's another video where this time he's leading the church against reparations, okay? So he believes that reparations is a more and political mistake, okay? So obviously Marc Lamont disagrees with him. And yeah, I kind of agree with Coleman Hughes, but um not because it's a more political mistake, but because I don't believe that all black people deserve reparations. Okay, so why? Because not all black people are descendants of slaves. Given that there wasn't slavery in all states back then, I don't know how many states there were, 40 something, I believe. So yeah, um, 30 something, I believe. And only 15 states have slavery in them. So that's why I don't believe that people whose ancestors weren't slaves, I don't agree that they should receive reparations. And also, black people who own slaves back then should their descendants shouldn't be receiving reparations as well. So how do you determine that? How can you know that? That's the problem with it for me. Yeah, anyhow, let's watch this video and you comment. Let me know what you think. If you agree with Coleman, if you agree with Mark. And also another one that has a great take on reparations is Dr. Moore position on this. Without further ado, why don't we get right into it? Oh, and also it's a two-part video. Given that the video is too long, I don't want to have a long video so no one watches it. This is why I made it in two parts. So this is part one, and part two I will be posting it probably in 2 days. All right, so let's watch.
On Juneteenth, 2019, when a House Judiciary Subcommittee held a hearing on the bill. The voice leading the charge against reparations on that day was Coleman Hughes, as he called the bill a moral and political mistake.
Black people don't need another apology. We need safer neighborhoods and better schools. We need a less punitive criminal justice system. We need affordable health care. And none of these things can be achieved through reparations for slavery. And the obligation of citizenship is not transactional. It's not contingent on ancestry. It never expires, and it can't be paid off. For all these reasons, Bill H.R. 40 is a moral and political mistake. Thank you.
Joining me now is Coleman Hughes. He's the host of Conversations with Coleman. It's a podcast that he hosts. Coleman, thank you so much for joining me. Let's get started right away with this question of opposing the idea of reparations. You talk about it as a moral mistake as well as a political mistake. What's the moral mistake here?
The moral mistake is that obviously when the victims of a historical crime are still alive, there is a moral obligation of the perpetrators to pay reparations. When we're talking about, so for instance, it would be a morally necessary, in my opinion, as I said at the hearing, to pay reparations for Jim Crow to survivors of the Jim Crow system. Now, on the other hand, when you're talking about the median Black American being around 35 years old or so, born in the 80s, is there a moral obligation to take money from one group of people and give it to that person for a crime that happened 200 years ago? that's a very different situation, and one in which you have to consider whether it's politically wise to do that, whether it actually serves the interests of the community that is suffering from many different problems in the present that need to be solved. To frame that solution as reparations, saying essentially blaming a group of people that don't feel connected to the crime because it was so long ago, right? So that's what I mean by a moral and political mistake.
So there's a few leaps there that I want to unpack with you for a minute. So you start by saying that it would be a morally proper thing to do if the victims of a crime were still alive. And then when we get to these people born in the 1980s, you're saying, well, if the redress comes through them, if we give it to their great-great-great-grandchildren, it produces a political sort of challenge and crisis for the community, if I understand you correctly. And it may not be the proper way to address the needs of the broader community. Understood. I hear that argument. That still doesn't address why it would be not moral to do so, right? If for example, there were a person who was enslaved and slavery ends and they have a child, just one generation, just a child who was denied access to housing, health care, and in general American prosperity because their parent was a slave, an enslaved African. Would you, just in that example, would you say that it would be improper to give reparations to them?
Yeah, so that I think in that case, probably it would be proper. And obviously it's a case by case basis, but the closer you are to the crime, the more plausible and morally required it is to give somebody reparations. And you always have to take into account the other side of the equation here, right? If my grandfather does something to if your grandfather did something horrible to my grandfather, I couldn't necessarily come to you and expect you to pay me directly, right? That would be immoral. So obviously, the closer you are to the crime, you're exactly right. The more necessary, the more morally required it is, and it's a damn shame that reparations were not paid to recently freed slaves and their children. Unfortunately, it is a different situation we're dealing with today, and you can't. It's not that just because reparations were due and never paid for a historical crime does not necessarily mean that the great great grandchildren, say, can demand of the great great grandchildren of the perpetrators that you pay me now. It's tragic, but a multiracial society with a history like we do cannot survive if the principle we're gonna abide by is we're not only solving our crimes, but we're trying to solve all of the crimes of history and litigate the oppression that has gone on in this country in the present.
So two things. One, the reason I was making that point about the one generation is because then you're not actually rejecting the idea of paying future generations as such. You're simply saying it's about the level of proximity to the harm that was done. What reparations advocates have been doing since the end of slavery is demonstrating the proximity of the harm. That means that whether it's 1865 or 1965 or 2020, there is considerable empirical data to show that slavery, the cost of slavery, the price of slavery, the impact of slavery continues to be felt by black people. And so while there may be a greater generational gap in terms of education, housing, healthcare, etc., we still see a considerable relationship between the harm and the violence of slavery and the impact it's had on multiple generations. And then the second thing you say, and I want you to respond to both of these, I want to give you space to respond to both of these, is this idea that we are somehow going to the grandchildren of people who were harmed and saying we're going to take care of it by going to the grandchildren of people who did the harm. That frames this as that frames reparations as this idea of going to white people and asking them to give money to black people. The idea of reparations is not that. That's not the claim made by anybody who's advocating for reparations. That's not the demand, that's not the request, and that's not the analysis that's being offered. The idea here is that the institutions that were created out of slavery, whether it's the insurance industry, whether it's the banking industry, whether it's certain railroad companies, or whether it is many universities, all of these things were born out of the institution and the violence and the crisis of slavery. And those institutions continue to live, they continue to thrive, and they continue to reproduce inequality. And so the idea here is not to go hat in hand to random white people and give their money to random black people. It's to analyze a system that has given power and privilege to those institutions, and also that has created a gap in opportunity between black folk and white folk. And the demand and the ask that's being made is of the institution, it's of the very government which was built on the exploited labor of enslaved African people. And so I would reject the characterization of reparations as you do, and rather see this as a way of, as we quite literally analyze it as, repairing the damage that was done. That's the idea here.
Okay, so two points to respond to there. The first is the idea that yes, slavery was technically long ago in terms of years, but the harm has persisted, and that can be shown in empirical data. So I think it's a lot more complicated than that. And listen, I know this is not a popular opinion, but my ancestors were slaves in this country, as most black peoples were, and I think there's a degree to which people born today are appropriating the struggles of our ancestors, and if you think about it, consider, for instance, hypothetically, a Jewish person born in the 90s. To what extent does the Holocaust impact him? If he's going to go around and say that he's struggling because of the Holocaust, I think a lot of people would be very skeptical of that. They would say, maybe your parents, maybe your grandparents, but there's a certain amount of removal from in years from the crime that makes those kinds of claims less plausible. And that's just my opinion. I understand that that's controversial, but I don't see how it's not true.
All right, guys. So I hope you enjoyed it as I enjoy watching this video. Comment, let me know what you think, and like the video, subscribe. Until next time, ciao, ciao. Have a great day.